All right, welcome, Fred. We are recording, and it's good to have you with me.
Yeah, same here.
Today, our goal here really is to chat a little bit about your book, and then I think use that as kind of a springboard to ask you about some of the other press inquiries or press responses we've seen and misunderstandings about holacracy, since you've just come off of doing a whole bunch of research for your book, and I'd also love to hear. Let's start with your book. Just before we begin, so you wrote a book, Reinventing Organizations, and you've got a whole section in there on holacracy, which was one of actually many. I'd say maybe uh, I'm not sure how many organizational practices were in there, but you at least looked at a lot of different organizations doing novel things, and then holacracy as a system that many are using. So just tell me a little bit more about the book and what was behind it, what motivated it, and where'd you end up with it?
Yeah, the book was really born 3 years ago. There were kind of 3 years of researching, writing it that went into it, um, from a personal frustration with the organizations with which I was working, coaching and consulting and facilitating. And I think a lot of people who are in that space of coaching and facilitating, come to the realization that it's not just about people and individuals. So you can help people gain more insights into themselves, uh, but the systems that most organizations operate on today is pretty toxic in itself. And so you can have fantastic coaching sessions, get people to, you know, really great insights. And, basically one of the best outcomes you can hope for is that at some point they say, I've had enough of this, toxic environment, rat race, and leave their organization. But unless they're the CEO, there's often not much they can do. And they go back into a toxic, environment, and, all of the great stuff that you've done often doesn't stick. So I was really tired of that, and just feeling like, I guess, many people, that you know more is possible, that more must be possible, and that there is a change of consciousness that is underway, that is calling for reinventing a lot of things in the world today, and one of them is the way we collaborate. And for instance, one of the
Yeah.
things we might talk about is more and more people just sense that the traditional hierarchy, the boss subordinate relationship, just somehow isn't working anymore, and many people are, just the time seem to be ripe, you know, for seeking alternatives. And so what I've been doing is researching quite extraordinary organizations, who have dared to really fundamentally question today's management paradigm and put pretty much all of what we take for granted, everything we learn in business school, on its head.
Yeah.
The whole deal, from structures to practices to processes to culture. Um,
Yeah.
and what they have achieved is really quite outstanding. And so they're just these really strange animals that nobody really understands. And for the most part, it hadn't been researched in any depth. Often, like the few articles that had appeared here or there were just saying something along the lines of, these organizations are spectacularly successful, but they shouldn't be, because somehow, this shouldn't be able to work. So at some point they will come down in flames, right? That was kind of the conclusion of many of the articles. Also recently, I guess, about holacracy. And it
Yep.
comes, I think, from a fundamental misunderstanding of what's happening here. And it's actually, I think, only when you start looking at a number of them, and I've looked at 12 really extraordinary organizations, and we put them side by side. And what's really exciting is to see the degree of overlap. So they're not identical. They operate in very different industries, very different geographies, but many of the practices are remarkably similar. And in the end, I think it's not surprising. If you take one coherence out of the organization, you can't just leave it, in a total flatland where there's no structure and no process, and naturally some other coherence emerges. And I
Yeah.
really believe that I stumbled, or that we're dealing here with kind of the next wave, that is coming. And maybe,
Yeah, that really resonates with me. I think I read an early draft of your book that you shared, and it struck me that the depth of the research you did for it, having seen a lot of different reporters and authors lately trying to make sense of holacracy, uh, more or less successfully in various cases. I was impressed the depth in which you really studied this and looked at both the similarities and the differences between the different organizations and the different models that you studied, um, but really trying to get a deep sense of the new paradigm and the shift. it was really remarkable. And I'm fascinated too. As you were talking there, it just occurred to me how timely the topic is. As you said, it's like there's this broader movement that's clearly happening in the world as uh, different organizations, different people are kind of waking up to there's got to be something next. There's got to be another approach, and more are experimenting to find it, or are jumping on and using alternate models like holacracy. Um, it's pretty cool, and I'm also struck by one of the things you said, which gets to some of the misunderstanding out there as well, which is you can't just throw out structure and say, right, great, that's the new approach, right? We just throw out what we don't like in the old one, and then um, and it's fascinating to me how many even reporters I've seen who have written articles about holacracy and other methods, as you mentioned, that look at them and see the absence of what we're used to, what we learn in business school, and assume that there's nothing to replace it. Assume that it's just gone.
Yeah.
And that's not what you found in your research, huh?
No, not at all. So
Yeah.
probably because I studied successful organizations. Some of these organizations have been around for quite a while, 10, 20, 30 years. I think there's plenty of examples of organizations who've gone down that other route of just throwing everything out and just believing that, let's take out hierarchy and let's just all be peers. And then realizing that if you do that, then horrible things do indeed happen, right? Then nobody knows, who can make what decision. And then, power games erupt behind the scenes just to get stuff done. And then there's cliques forming. So, we've all had that probably in school, So I think part of the reaction from journalists is just that we probably all have been scarred at some point by groups that don't have structure, that don't have
Right.
leaders, and realizing how horrible it can be. And so, sometimes I'm a bit critical with these articles and these journalists, but then I try to be compassionate and think, many of these journalists, have to write an article in 3 or 4 hours and
Yeah.
don't have the benefit of spending all the time that you and I have
Write a
spent
book.
on this.
Yeah.
And really, the depth of the paradigm shift here is enormous.
Yeah.
Right? I mean, there's just a change in worldview. I mean, we've all grown up with the idea, for instance, just to take one example, that okay, you can have a group without a boss if you're 4 or 5 people, maybe that's possible. But as soon as you're more than that, come on,
Yeah.
somebody, there needs to be a structure, and somebody needs to call the shots, right?
Yeah.
And it's such a deeply held assumption.
Yeah.
And we really need to switch to another set of assumptions, which is, yes, hell, we need structure, but we don't necessarily need a boss, right? And
Yeah.
actually, there's many evidence now that having structure without a boss, is vastly superior.
Yeah, yeah, I'd say it's fascinating. I mean, if we just look around our broader world and society, I think the argument of, hey, if you just you just remove structure, hierarchy is going to reestablish and all that. One misses the fact that you're actually replacing structure with a different kind of structure. And when you do that, just look around at our world. I don't see a lot of people clamoring to be, the warlord dictator of the United States or any major modern country, right? It doesn't happen. There's a structure there that actually prevents it. There's a really good structure there. It's just not a structure that relies on a big man hierarchy in the way
I,
we're used to inside organizations.
I, I think I found a way to bring that over even to the most skeptic, which is to say, um, hierarchy is actually okay in a pretty low complexity environment. But as
Yeah.
soon as you're in a high complexity environment, hierarchy is out of its depth, right?
Yep.
There's no single very complex system in the world that is run with hierarchy. There's
Yeah.
structure, there's coordinating mechanisms, but no hierarchy, right? No one in his right mind would ask for a market economy to be run Soviet style, right?
Yeah.
With a central planning bureau. And yet, for some
Yep.
strange reasons, we think that within the organizations, let's have the Soviet planning bureau, which we call the executive committee,
Yeah.
right? Take the human brain, 85 billion cells, all firing at
Hmm.
the same time, and there's hundreds of millions of processes happening at the same time. And no single cell is in command. There's no cell that has an executive committee that says, like, you all stay quiet, while we kind of make up our stuff, and then we'll communicate it to you, right?
Right.
And so all of the complex system in the world, the traffic system, ecosystem, forest, the winter comes too early. All the system adapts with tons of coordinating mechanisms. But there isn't a tree that is the CEO that says, wait, I'm going to make a plan for how we're going to deal with the winter, and I'll let you know, and we'll roll it out, right? So I think
Hmm.
times are ready for us to catch up with that reality that to navigate really complex environments, we need
Yeah.
a lot of structure and coordinating mechanisms, but actually not a hierarchy, because hierarchy can't handle that. And we just need to borrow from nature's rule book. And this is really what a lot of these organizations that I've researched have done, and which Holacracy does beautifully.
Yeah, that brings me to another one of the misconceptions I've seen out there lately with all the press behind Holacracy, and I'm curious if you saw it or what your research showed you around, especially employee engagement or disengagement. One of the common critiques that kind of often comes with well, if you throw out structure, you're going to end up with a conventional power structure emerging instead, which actually misses again all the things we just talked about. But with that is also the critique sometimes that if you throw out the bosses and all that, that's not the path to an engaged workforce. In fact, that's just going to create the infighting. All our competitive nature will erupt as humans, and we'll be back to territorial fighting and all that, which sure has some wisdom in it. That yeah, of course there is a territorial quality to all animals, humans included. So what have you found in your research around engagement or disengagement, and how removing the typical management structure as the ground for the organization's power, how does that affect engagement, and what do you think of that critique that is floating around?
So the critique, in my sense, is totally valid if you just take out structure and put nothing in place.
Yeah, me
Then
too.
indeed, I mean, we've all been
Yeah,
scarred by that at some point, Playground or Lord of the Flies, and
yeah,
so I fully understand where that's coming from, but it's missing the point that it is possible to put in a whole different set of structure,
yeah,
again, inspired by nature,
yeah,
where a huge amount of that is taken out.
yeah,
One of the things, and again, this is not easy to understand, but one of the things that happens in these organizations is that power is no longer in limited supply.
ah, that's a great point.
In a classical pyramid, power is in limited supply. And whatever power I have, you don't have. And if you're my underling, I might empower you, but then there's some power that's taken away from me, and why would I empower you? So some organizations go down that path, and then they invest a huge amount in having a great culture that empowers people, and it's a
Yeah,
step up, right?
yeah,
What happens in these other structures? So again, structures, but without the classical hierarchy, is that really everybody is fully powerful to take any decision that matters to them.
mhm,
And what you see happens then is just an enormous employee engagement, and actually very, very little ego games and very little power games and all of that stuff that has been polluting. So
yeah,
what happens in these critiques like turf wars and cliques and power games, I don't need that anymore. I can just do whatever I want to do. I'm fully
yeah,
powerful in my domain. And so I don't need to play these games. I don't need cliques. I don't
yeah.
even need to convince people, because I'm fully powerful to do what I
I
need
need
to do. And
to.
so the employee engagement in these organizations is absolutely off the chart, which makes, again, totally counterintuitive things, but that a lot of the things that we take for granted, like we need to have targets and we need to have incentives, otherwise people will just be lazy and won't do anything. A lot of that disappears,
Yeah,
which is not to say that there aren't mechanisms to be transparent about performance. They absolutely
yeah,
are.
yeah,
And people who don't perform, it becomes very visible. So it's
yeah.
but what happens in most of these organizations is people are just hugely engaged, and if somebody is being lazy, then somebody else will quickly call them up on it and say, hey, what's happening? Why are you unhappy?
Some of the most engaged workers I know are entrepreneurs. You've got the kind of autonomy and the kind of self-direction motivation that an entrepreneur typically has. You don't need to be motivated. I mean, you're pursuing a kind of a creative impulse, and you've got the autonomy you need to do it. And I think one of the things that Holacracy and other systems like that do is allow people to be more entrepreneurial and have. I love how you said it's more power across the board. When I talk about Holacracy as a distributed power system, I think it's easy to think of that as taking the power that used to exist at the top and just taking the same amount of power and breaking it up, and then everyone's got just a little bit of power, but that's actually not it. It's actually raising the total amount of power, if you will, in the system, and it does it by getting more people more power, and that's what I mean by distributed power. It's throughout the organization, and um, on the territorial comment, a colleague of mine that trains Holacracy in Paris once said, Holacracy deals with the territorial nature of humans simply by giving everyone a territory. And I thought that was a really good point. It's not trying to combat the fact that we can be territorial. It's not trying to prevent it or remove it. It's simply saying, all right, fine, here's your territory. You're king of your territory. Now what? Now what are you going to do with that? How are you going to create from that? How are you going to add value? Um,
Maybe
and
we need
just
to.
making clear what your power is, what your territory is, so you don't have to worry about it.
Yeah. Maybe there's one thing we need to add, because there's a lot of misconceptions. We project things onto, oh, no more hierarchy. Right?
Yeah,
One of them is, for instance, then decisions get made by consensus, and I think that's an important one to debunk.
yeah,
Right? We've been raised with the assumption that there's basically two ways to make decisions, either hierarchical or consensus,
yeah,
and both of them, are deeply lacking in some way.
yeah.
Hierarchy, people end up often disliking the decision that's being made, but at least somebody makes a decision and we can go forward. Right?
Mhm.
Consensus, everybody gets a voice, but often it ends up being a horrible process.
Yeah,
Long and no decision get made and paralysis, and at the end, people just stop caring and say, "There's somebody, please make a decision." Whatever, I stopped caring.
yeah,
And what all of these organizations I researched that got rid of, the classical hierarchy found is a third way that is neither hierarchical, so no one holds power over anyone else and can impose anything, nor is it consensus,
mhm,
right? And there's a common principle behind this all that is, then packaged in different ways,
yeah,
and Holacracy refines it, and to a great degree, others, have, more simple and maybe more blunt approach to it.
yeah,
But fundamentally, the thing is that, you know, anyone can make any decision in a domain that we've either agreed up front, or if I've taken into account, perspective of other people on that domain. So it's really the best of both worlds. It's anybody has anything meaningful to say gets to
yeah,
say it, but the
yeah,
decision is still an individual one. So if I feel passion for something, I
yeah.
go for it. Nobody can stop me if I really want to go for it, right? And so it's the best of both worlds. And so no consensus. Maybe we should really make that clear.
Yeah, make that point clear. Yeah, which ironically is again a lot like what happens in a market. If you look at how we transact in a market economy, we're certainly not coming to big group consensus decisions on how to allocate resources or spend our money or pursue our passions or whatever. They're individual decisions. I choose what I do with my time. I choose what I do with my money. I choose what I do with my energy, um, and yet. So does everyone else, and it's not I'm not imposing there's clear property boundaries. I don't get to just impose my vision by going and taking my neighbor's car and using it to my ends, right? I know there's boundaries there, and I know I do have autonomy in my domain, and not over my neighbor. And the same is true for my neighbor and everyone else. And I think what I hear you saying is actually bringing an element of what makes a market, what enables a market to deal with complexity so well. It's by harnessing individual actors within a framework of boundaries that allow them to each do their thing without requiring consensus, and yet still know that they're not going to be stepping all over each other. I don't need my neighbor's permission when I decide how to use my time and energy, as long as I'm not violating one of his domains, if you
And
will.
then there are all sorts of coordinating mechanisms,
Yeah.
right, between
Hmm.
like you and your neighbor, or companies that act in the marketplace, right? So
Yeah,
it's
and
not a
in the
free for all.
marketplace we have price systems and we have various players that help coordinate. In an organization, you may have different systems, but nonetheless coordinating or integrating systems, aligning systems. In Holacracy, we have governance meetings that align and help determine those territories. You have other rules of the game that help as well. And I think that's it's funny. It is so different from how we think of organizations, and yet it's such a common experience that we have in our day-to-day world. Look around us. We don't have bosses telling us how to live our lives. And yet we also don't have consensus with everyone that lives around us, and or even with our own family. Often we have different opinions and different individual decisions and all that. Um, and that brings me. We talked about complexity a little bit, and I think one of the powers of a system like that relies neither on top-down planning and direction nor consensus. It allows more a capacity to deal with complexity. And I think that gets to one of the other criticisms, which I find interesting and ironic in uh, that light. But some of the things that I hear sometimes, perhaps part true and part misunderstanding, but about holacracy and many of these other systems is that they're too complex. If you look at holacracy, there's a big constitution under it, and there's all these rules of the game, 30 pages of rules of the game for how this whole organizational system is going to work, and that is people could claim quite complex. And too complex to be, effective or useful or what have you. It's heavyweight. What do you make of that from your research and what you looked at and what you know about holacracy as well? What about that criticism, would you say?
Yeah, I think it's, again, pretty fundamental misunderstanding. I think all of these systems in holacracy cut through an enormous amount of complexity. Like, people that look at these organizations say it all seems so effortless. And that's because, so much of what we spend our time with, which is all these power games, all these trying to look good to the boss, preparing for the meetings, all the territoriality, all this target settings and incentives and budgets and, all of that huge complexity. I mean, pretty much all of the higher levels of management spend 80 to 90% of their time on that. Right? All of that is taken out. So actually, these organizations, in many ways, are hugely simple. We just mostly do work. We get rid of that, right? So, so these organizations, in many, many ways, are much, much simpler, because there's not, all of these alignments, all of these meetings at all of these levels. The information doesn't cascade up, and then this information gets made up, and then it gets cascaded down again. So all of that is getting rid of. So that's, I think, misguided. There is clearly a learning curve. To this, and that, I think, is a valid point. It's such a change of paradigm that there's a learning curve to it, right? And you talk about it in holacracy. For a few months, people might be disorientated because they just so much have to relearn and orient to something new. And there is maybe some criticism that could be made for holacracy, not a criticism, but holacracy really has made the choice to really perfect the system in bringing total clarity. Right? And it's a real value in holacracy. And once you get it, the system is just, wow, it's wonderful. I have clarity. There's no more, what can I really expect? Where are the boundaries? So no more all of that creeping back into the system. It also makes that holacracy, the learning curve is quite high. So I've seen some of the other organizations that just have, let's say, 50% of the building blocks of what holacracy has, and maybe gets 80% of the benefits. And so you might argue that for some organizations that might be a good choice, and you still have 20% of gray zone where there's no, not much clarity, and some of that old, ego might creep in, and then it's kind of a choice. Do you go for something with a bit less of a learning curve, but you get still some of the pollution, or do you really go for total clarity? And so let me give you an example. One of the really amazing organizations I researched is Buurtzorg, a Dutch neighborhood care organization. They have 7,500 nurses, absolutely no hierarchy. And they have really all of the essential elements. But neighborhood nursing, all these 7,500 work in 750 teams of 10 nurses who pretty much do all of, pretty much all do the same thing. Cool. There isn't really any, much link between these except some knowledge exchange. There isn't really headquarters. There isn't. It's a very simple system. So if they would ask me, should we, adopt holacracy, I would probably say, yes, you would get clearly some more benefits. There's, some more clarity would be created. Is it worth the learning curve? Maybe, maybe not. On the other hand, let's take still in healthcare. If there's a pharma company, pharma is a very long value chain, right? From research and then, all the testing and the regulatory and the production and blah, blah. In that case, I'd say, no way you could do it with one of the other systems. Just go for holacracy. Because, your organization is so complex, you need that clarity. So in some organizations, you might get away with a little bit less clarity and do that trade-off. Pharma company, I would just say, no way. And so maybe that's one thing to say here is that the difference between holacracy and the other systems I looked at is holacracy is the only one that is a system that is basically packaged, that has trainers that can be easily adopted, right? The background to this is you experimented a lot of that in your old company with your colleagues when you had a software company, and then at the some point decided to put that under new management, and now you've really in the works of packaging that. The other organizations have
Yeah.
just developed something for themselves, haven't packaged it, and so have just pushed it as far as they felt it was necessary for them.
Yeah. And
At some point
that's
it's like,
very
really
much
not.
how we
You've really
started.
perfected it.
Yeah, that's how we started as well. Holacracy was born out of just finding something that works for us. And it took years and years and years of effort to package it and to abstract it enough to something that was general enough to apply to any kind of organization and not just the one it was birthed in. And I do think that is a significant difference and I'd say a value for anyone who wants to find a method to do this. You can develop your own, and there are cases where I think that's actually a perfectly appropriate solution. It's hard to adopt somebody else's, though, if it's not packaged, if it's not genericized and made into a set of clear rules that has a path to adopt and support and all that. Um, but one thing I wanted to hit on that you were just talking about, I thought was really intriguing about the complexity. So a colleague of mine responded, I heard once to that it's too complex with a question, which is, well, if you take a typical organization, especially a larger one, but even a smaller, mid-sized one, and you were to write down all of the rules for how power works there, all of the subtle. I mean, good luck even trying to document them. You'd end up with a document that was hundreds of pages, and the rules would actually be self-contradictory. It was, you can do this except, and then insert something completely opposite. And it's all a mess, and especially with the politics we see in a lot of organizations, you wouldn't have a 30-page cohesive document that had a learnable set of rules. You'd have something that was much harder to use and actually much more complex. So I really think that, as you said, the fair part of that critique is there is a learning curve, and that's a real issue, and it's not something you can just pick up really quick and then go do perfectly. It's a discipline, and it takes learning a whole new way of playing the game of business. Um, and yet the rule set itself, it bakes a lot of complexity in, perhaps, or it deals with complexity, I think, pretty elegantly. But the rule set itself is actually pretty intuitive once you learn it. Once you're through that learning curve, it kind of all hangs on a pretty cohesive logic that you can intuit, and then you don't need to remember all of the little details and nuance. You just kind of get the sense of it. Like a lot of other good games, if you play a complex board game, or whatever, the rules may at first seem complex if you jump into a new, especially the war games or whatever, the complex board games. But the good ones, anyway, that I think end up being a lot of fun to play, have kind of a cohesion in them. So the rules kind of all hang together right. They all make sense. And I think that's not the case in most of our organizations today. The rules are not only not written down, but they're not cohesive. They don't make sense together. They're not fair. They don't inspire playing a fun game together. They inspire something quite different, So I think that's a really intriguing point, and it's also going back to the market economy link too. And in a market economy, there's also a set of rules at play. But the beauty is, no one has to understand the entire giant big picture of how a market works to play in it. You need to understand, for you locally, what you can do and what you can't do. You need to understand the basics of don't steal from someone, the basics of you're free to act, the stance of freedom and autonomy. But beyond that, you don't need to understand all of the nuance and all of the details of how the whole system is going to work together. You just need to understand your way of playing in that, and your way of showing up. And then the complexity is emergent. From there, it's the interactions from local actors just applying some simple local rules that allows the complexity to develop and to handle tasks, to handle coordination, rather, that no one individual could handle if they tried to wrap their head around the whole thing and direct it, which is pretty remarkable.
And there's something common in all these organizations and people just relaxing into doing work.
Yeah.
It's only when you're there that you realize to what extent in traditional organizations there's all the formal hierarchy and how everything should work, and then there's all these unset expectations,
Yeah.
all of these power games, all of these posturing, trying to look good and to impress and then second guessing people and all of that, which we've
Yeah.
taken so much for granted in many ways that it just seems like a natural environment.
Yeah.
And suddenly when you go into a healthy environment, there's just something that happens where the shoulders drop and you just go like,
Yeah.
um,
Yeah, I feel it. And actually, that brings us to our final critique I wanted to talk to you about, which is um, it's been said occasionally that hey, all of this isn't it too inward focused? Where's the customer in this? Where's the customer focus? Any organization without a good, clear customer focus is not going to last long. You've got to be delivering value to your customers if you want to be in business. Um, and all of these systems are so inward focused with how we organize. So um, what do you think? Is Holacracy or any of these other organizations, are they not integrating the customer in this well enough? Are they not customer focused enough? And how do you reconcile that? Yeah, there is all this inward focus on the interior of how we organize, and what about the customer?
Yeah.
What do you think?
Well, but by definition, this is about, giving the organization that serves a customer a different structure, practices, and processes. So by definition, we're going to talk about, um, and so by definition, during the learning curve stage, we might spend some time, for a few months, adjusting to the system. And so maybe, for a few months, we might, lose the eye on the customer, even though, I believe that very quickly we also, stop doing all of the other things that was inward focus. So again, we keep forgetting about how incredibly
Yeah,
inward focused, all of the large organizations are. I mean,
it's true.
all of the top management levels, tend to focus only on inside meetings and budgets and stuff, and then there's a CEO who's all proud to say, well, I meet at least one customer a day, and just to as a symbolic act. But really, we spend all of our time inside, cascading budgets and support
Yeah,
staff dreaming up plans and project and imposing them to everyone else, and then everybody else rebelling, and then pretending that they do it, and then making internal slides and documents, and somebody down there has an idea but it needs approval up there, and so it goes to up one level and then up one level and up one level, and all meetings, and then these meetings need to be pre-sold, and that is all of the inward focus. And so pretty much all of that gets taken care of. And so by having better internal structures, we actually have time to do the work of the organization, which is serving a purpose, and that purpose is outside of the boundaries of the organization.
yeah, and I think that was something I heard you mention earlier about your research as well, that one of the things you found common in a lot of these organizations was a purpose-driven focus, right? A focus on purpose. And I think that almost by definition implies focus on the customer, at least if the organization has to earn money to stay alive. Your purpose has got to include something that is valuable enough for people to pay you for, which means
Yeah.
customer. And
One of the
and
things
I
that
think that's true with Holacracy for sure.
one of the things that happens often, not always, but in these organizations is, the thing that pushes a leader, a company founder, or a CEO that takes up over a traditional company to engage in this whole thing is,
Hmm.
if we just look at the individual level, that in many ways they have their own ego under control, right?
Yeah.
Because if you do
Yep.
this, you're giving up a lot of
Yeah.
formal power, which is often an
Yeah.
illusion of control as a CEO, but you
Yes.
believe it. Well, you sit at the top, you believe it. To a
And
system,
one that strokes the ego really well.
right? Exactly. It serves their ego really well if you're
Yeah.
sitting at the top. And so
Yep.
pretty much all of these founders are people who have, gone through some personal development, some spiritual development, or whatever, but are people who have their ego under control and realize, hey, I don't need to be this all-powerful boss that sits at the top, that gives all the direction. I'm happy to hand that over to a system that will also apply to me, right? And in many ways, you can
Yep.
argue that they become more powerful, just like everyone else, because power is not taken away from
Yep.
them. In many ways, they're more powerful than. But anyway, that's another discussion. But what brings these people to have their ego under control also brings them to wonder about a deeper sense of purpose in many cases, right?
Mm.
Suddenly, whether the organization itself grows or doesn't grow, whether it's a success or not, isn't measured in the traditional ways of the CEO that, I just want to have the biggest empire, I want, to have status. And so they can focus on what is really the purpose that we're serving. And so
Yep.
quite a few of these organizations are really transformative in how they behave in the marketplace and become really quite extraordinary, service organizations to the customers, coming from that perspective by saying, hey, ultimately, it's not about us. It's not about the organization. It's really about the deeper purpose that we serve. And then the irony of that is, of course, that then customers tend to love you, and that makes the companies grow tremendously. So the most spectacular example is again this Dutch neighborhood organization. They start with 10 people in late 2006, and now they're 7,500. 75% of all neighborhood nurses in the Netherlands now work for them. They're just deserting all of the traditional organizations because they say,
Wow.
please, can we work for you? Right? They receive 400 CVs a month, because the power of how it's organized internally makes that people can finally do the nursing work, right?
Yeah,
And
that's amazing.
clients love it because it's really purpose driven. It's really about the purpose of making clients autonomous, and not about how efficient are we giving shots and stuff.
Yeah. Yeah, that really resonates. Cool. Well, I think that's an awesome note to wrap this up on there, Fred. Before we stop, though, if people are interested in diving into your book and the research, where can they find it?
They can find it on Amazon, so Reinventing Organizations. They can also find it on the website of the book, reinventingorganizations.com, where I do a funny experiment for people who want to engage in it. They can download, if they like electronic versions, Kindle, iBook, or PDF version, at the same price as you would get on Amazon for $10, or they can download it in a pay what feels right mode. You can download it and mark your calendar if you play the game a month later, and then donate back whatever you think value you think the book has given to you. So it's the book has just been out for a month, so it's too early to tell how that experiment goes, but I'm quite excited. But if you want a paper copy, Amazon or any other local bookstore can get it for you.
That's great. Cool. Well, Fred, thanks for taking the time to chat with me, and also for your research. I think it's an awesome contribution to bring more awareness to what's, I think, a really growing movement, not just about holacracy, but more broadly, as you say, reinventing organizations. It's something near and dear to my heart, and I really appreciate your energy and interest in holacracy in that context. And thanks for taking the time to chat with me today.
Thanks to you, and thanks to whoever listens to this.
Great. Thanks, Fred. Bye.